Welcome back to Missing. I am Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I am doing fantastic today. Again, very excited to bring our listeners this remastered version of the Sheila Shepherd murder. We did this series where we went to Saratoga Springs, New York, and spoke with detectives Callahan and Wilson. And now we introduce a new / the original investigator of Sheila Shepherd's murder. So we've kind of taken it to the next level in this episode, in this conversation, in our work on her unsolved murder.
Absolutely, and we invite you to check out our YouTube page where there is video going up with these episodes. So check that out at youtube.com/missingcsm. Well, Lance, for this episode today, we have number 7 in our series on the unsolved murder of Sheila Shepherd from 1980 in Saratoga Springs, New York.
Yep. We keep pumping out these episodes on Sheila Shepherd because our time there in New York that we spent with the investigators, the current investigators, and now one of the former investigators, the original investigator, one of them, the story just keeps playing out.
Yeah, we've recorded a little bit more with this fella, Tom Mitchell. He is one of the original investigators, worked the case from day one. And so we were lucky enough to have him for like an hour and a half. So we talked with him. And so what we're going to play in this episode is the first part of that interview. And it's kind of a wide-ranging conversation. And it's really interesting, especially if you've listened to the other episodes where there is some, I don't want to say conflicting information, maybe a little bit as far as conflicting from maybe some of our speculations, Lance, but it seems like what we find here is like exactly what we've always talked about, where it's kind of like a battle of new school policy, like law enforcement officers, investigators, versus like an old school approach that Tom Mitchell has. And so it's kind of interesting to see it play out right in front of us.
Oh, yeah, for real. I mean, you could see from Tom's expression some apprehension when he realized how much information we were being shown and how much access we had. He wasn't by any means hostile, but he was one way before the interview, and he was old school police officer investigator Tom Mitchell during the interview. There was a lot of answers that he gave us off the record. But not to say that he didn't provide information on the record, but there was a definite line in the sand that was drawn once the recorder started.
Yeah, it's almost like it. In listening back, it kind of plays out a little bit like a game of Clue, or it like reminds me of such when we're questioning Tom, because it's like, okay, well, if this is true and that's true, then this must be true, and he's like, well, I'm not saying that. So you kind of have to take the answers and piece it together for yourself, but it makes for an interesting mental exercise for sure.
And part of the information that we were given access to by the investigators Callahan and Wilson is a early John Douglas profile of the killer of Sheila Shepherd, which he put together very shortly after her murder. And it was there on the table. It was almost like looking at sort of a relic, like a holy grail type item there. And as interesting as it was for us to just be in the presence of this document, we were able to hear Tom Mitchell's experience as he worked with John on this.
And of course, John Douglas is a former FBI agent who founded the Behavioral Analysis Unit and really was part of the group that kind of coined the term serial killer. And he's an author. He's gone on to write several books, and you may know his name from the Netflix show Mindhunter, where the lead of that show is based on him. Okay, cool. So here is the interview with investigator Tom Mitchell. And we'll be back with an outro to this interview. How's it going, Tom? Thanks for coming down.
You're welcome.
So your involvement in Sheila Shepherd's case, what was that? And what was your position in the police department?
I was an investigator at the time when this occurred, and I was one of the investigators that was involved in the investigation into the crime.
How long did you work on it?
Until I retired in 1996.
So 16 years.
Yes.
How often were you revisiting it?
It depended on whether new information came in, whether it be someone telling us, providing information, or exploring something that had occurred elsewhere that may have a connection.
Okay.
Does this case stick with you?
Yes, it does.
Is it because of the fact that it's unsolved? Is it?
Well, it's a combination of things, that I was a part of the initial investigation. I knew the family. I knew the victim. I'm from Saratoga Springs. I raised my family there and spent almost 30 years with the police department.
You knew Sheila, you met her?
I knew of her, yes.
Yeah.
I knew her as a young child. I didn't know her as she got older, but I knew her parents.
When did you get the call about it? When did you first hear about it?
I was working the evening shift, so I hadn't come on duty yet. I got a call at home being called into duty to assist in the investigation at the scene.
And what did you think when you got there?
That we had a homicide.
Yeah.
It was the very early stages. The body was still there. The coroner hadn't arrived yet. Preliminary things were being done, the photographing and identifying evidence.
So that was on Tuesday or Wednesday?
I believe she was discovered on a Tuesday.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would have been the day she was discovered.
Oh, so you were there the day she was discovered?
Yes.
Okay.
I was called in.
Okay.
Other officers had been there prior to my arrival, but I was called in and joined into the investigation.
Okay.
Is anything weird about the crime scene other than obviously there's a victim?
There were some things that were unusual. It wasn't a situation that you would expect, and by that I mean that there wasn't knife wounds other than there was a knife present, but there was nothing to suggest that it had been a stabbing that caused this death.
What was your experience with crime scenes up until that point?
I had, at that point, it's 1980, I had a dozen or more years experience in the police department. I had been involved in other crimes and investigations. It's a small city, so there weren't a lot of homicides, fortunately, and it remains that way today.
Were you a detective then?
We were called investigators.
Oh, okay.
Same difference, but we were investigators. I was an investigator, yes.
What's your first step when you go onto a scene?
Well, this had already been started, so
Yeah.
I was just joining in the process. Normally, you would, make sure it's secured, notify the ranking officers above you, get a hold of a medical examiner or coroner, depending on the circumstances.
Have you worked on other murder investigations before?
I don't think I had at that point.
Okay. And looking back at your career, does that one stand out as far as the crime scene and everything, as far as it being a murder investigation?
It's different than the norm.
Yeah, because of the post-mortem wounds?
Well, a number of things.
Yeah.
The way the body was left, the report of the after-death stabbing, the actual cause of death, those are different than usual.
What did you think the cause of death was?
It was reported by the coroner's office that it was asphyxiation due to the gag to the mouth.
Okay.
The gag which we saw, and it was that
Right.
fabric.
Yeah, it would have been the same one that would have been present when investigators show up at the time.
So that was the thing that killed her?
Yes.
Your timeline of her life before her murder, is it the same as what these gentlemen are working off of?
I would believe so, yes.
Yeah.
That she was last seen on Saturday, for sure, and after that it becomes a little cloudy.
Last seen by her mother.
Correct.
What time?
I believe that was in the afternoon. I don't recall the time of that, but we did have and found at the scene a cash register receipt from a local supermarket that indicated that purchases had been made that evening. And we have witnesses on the street that report seeing her headed in a downtown direction also that evening. But after that, it's debatable as to the accuracy.
Just because of Saturday night in the city and...
Well, not so much that, not that many people had seen her, obviously, or we would have had more information.
Yeah.
People that thought they saw her one day, in fact, turned out to be a different day.
that actually happened?
Yes.
Do you believe she had consensual sex before, or was that able to be proven?
There was no indication of that.
But she definitely wasn't assaulted and raped.
There was no evidence to lead you to believe that.
Okay.
The store that we saw the receipt at, that's Grand Union?
It was a Grand Union supermarket.
Okay.
They were a supermarket chain in the Northeast back at that time frame. They have since gone out of business.
And that was walking distance from her place?
Yes, it would be along the route between her parents' apartment and hers at the opposite end of town.
And how soon after all of this did her ex-husband, you said that he voluntarily came in to be questioned?
Yes.
How soon after?
I don't have the exact time, but it was within a day or two. We made contact with him, requested that he come, and he did.
And he was okay? He was, other than probably...
No, he was upset over
yeah.
the loss, but other than that, he was fine.
And you questioned him and you cleared him pretty much immediately? Or was there time?
I wouldn't say we cleared him immediately. His, alibi, we'll say, was, proven to be correct. His demeanor was appropriate. But at that stage, certainly no one had been either eliminated or strongly considered.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there was nothing taken from the apartment. The only thing that's been reported as missing is the photographs, right?
Keys.
I'd rather not comment what is missing from the apartment, if anything.
Okay. Did you walk into the apartment and think that there had been any forced entry at all?
There was no evidence of that.
Because I imagine it'd be obvious.
Well, if they had to make a forcible entry, it would be obvious. If it were an unlocked door and a person invited in, then there wouldn't be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there was no evidence to support those theories.
Do you think this is someone who was familiar to Sheila?
Most definitely.
Yeah.
Someone who knew her and she knew them.
Have you ever entertained the idea that someone was waiting there for her?
There was no evidence to support that either. You expect if this was a planned event that there would be some resistance on her part, and there was nothing to suggest that.
And was she left-handed or right-handed?
I recently read, I believe she was right-handed, but I can't be 100% sure.
And how busy was the street back then? Because we were out there the other day, and we had trucks going by. And
Saratoga has changed dramatically
Yeah.
in that many years. I mean, it was a small town. The population was dramatically less. There were more vacant lots than there were bar rooms now.
Yeah.
And the same thing as far as, the development. There's very little free space, and there's a lot more traffic all the time.
Mm-hmm. What about the Cool Whip?
Again, I'd really rather not discuss too much about what was found in the apartment.
Okay.
There was an account that was pretty fascinating where someone saw flashlights or reported that there was a flashlight in the apartment. How many days after? Was that
That weekend, she found on the Tuesday the 25th, it was the 28th. There's a report, Dan Jewett and somebody else go to the apartment. Somebody reported walking by, they see flashlights. They think there's flashlights inside.
Yeah, I believe I was on duty that night, and I was there also, and that was unfounded.
Okay, nothing to it.
unfounded meaning? You
Didn't find any evidence that anyone had been in the apartment. It was locked when we got there, and there was no indication anyone had been in there.
Okay. Now, what about the keys, though? I don't know if you want to talk about the keys, but there were keys missing when...
That again is something I'd rather not talk about. It's not confirmed that there were or were not keys missing.
Right. Okay.
tell me you don't want to talk about it if you want, but so were there keys that were turned in that might be hers?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
You spoke with John Douglas, and he had a profile done?
He performed the profile, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd love to take a look at that and sort of ask you about your recollection of that.
You know the protocol on those release of that information?
No, that's...
I would check
If you just
With
want to
the
talk about
author.
your, okay.
I can talk about my involvement, but as
Okay.
far as,
Yeah, that's fine. We kind of left that to however you wanted to handle that when you came in, since you were actually there at the time.
Yeah, we won't get into like.
yeah, I don't know if that was anything, parts of it were made public, and I don't know about its entirety. I don't believe it was.
Okay. How much did you know about what he did at the time?
What
What John Douglas did?
we
I guess my real question is, how did you meet him and how did the topic come up?
We presented the facts of our case and submitted it to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit for their study to assist us in our investigation. Special Agent Douglas was the behavior scientist that performed our analysis and reported back to us. And we explored the things that he presented as potential leads that could be helpful. There came a time when I was a student at the FBI National Academy, and during my attendance, I sat down with him and we reviewed our file and his findings.
And that was like proven to be pretty helpful, or was it? Honestly, was it something you read and you're like, I kind of knew this already?
There were parts that, were expected,
Yeah.
and there were other parts that were most helpful and remain to be helpful.
Cool. Cool. Did you guys like want to get the FBI involved from the beginning?
It was a relatively new approach
Okay.
at that time, and I believe we were made aware of it by perhaps a local FBI agent or state police or someone had suggested it, and we took advantage of it.
Okay. Okay, you took advantage of it. So how does that? What's the process?
There's a form that has to be completed. You present the facts of your case to meet the criteria to perform the analysis.
And then how soon after her body was discovered did they become involved?
I couldn't give you an exact time, but it was within a reasonable amount of time. I don't know whether it was weeks or perhaps a month, but I'm not sure. But it wasn't very long.
Did the holidays kind of like?
Well, they
Throw a-
played a role.
Yeah.
For example, I mean, she's discovered just a couple days before Thanksgiving, so people are on the move, they're not home, and so forth. I remember conducting street canvasses, looking for any information we could get, and virtually every place we went, there was no response because of the holiday. And then obviously we went from Thanksgiving into the Christmas and New Year holidays, so I'm sure that played a role in getting a response on that analysis.
Is it your belief, or was it the profile's belief that the killer would have involved himself in the investigation in some way?
I'm not sure that came from that profile, but that had been explored and suggested along the lines.
Is that something that you believe to be true?
It's hard to say.
Do you have an idea on who you think it is? Like, are you down to one or two or three people? Or?
I wish I did. We
Yeah.
wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was there ever a time where, like, when you were getting information and you were interviewing people, did you think you had the person?
There were persons considered more so than others, but obviously, we never had enough to come to a conclusion.
Do you still check in with these guys and go over some of the?
Yes, quite regularly.
Yeah.
And I've met with investigators before these two gentlemen were
Yeah.
involved in the case. So I've stayed actively involved, over the years.
What do you do now?
I'm a private fire investigator.
Like arson and stuff, or just fires and?
I investigate fires for insurance companies.
That's cool. Did you ever do stuff like that with the department?
That's where I got my foundation for my second career.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Did these guys ever reach out to you and say, who should we talk to?
Yes.
You guys have overlapping interviews?
Oh, yeah, certainly. That was the first thing I did when I got the case, was reading through and then kind of go back and try to re-interview the people that were talked to at the time, were persons of interest. And I think Tom's the first one that I interviewed, was talked to him, as he had the most involvement, it looked like, and the most case narratives and things. So the first thing we did was had him in for, I think I said it would be quick, but I think it ended up being 3+ hours of just, well, how about this tip, or how about this idea, or what about this person, or is this a wild goose chase or a waste of time? And I know I've called a couple different times where just something will pop up and say, like, do you remember this, or what do you think about that? So yeah, Tom's been a great resource, definitely. Your memory is impressive of events and details from almost 40 years ago now.
For quite a while.
Yeah.
It's not, yeah, you're still living it, yeah, but directly involved with it for 16 years, right? At least.
Yes.
Yeah.
So is there anything you can tell us that has been ruled out in your mind or for the case?
Not that I can think of. I mean, it's an open case, so all things are out there for consideration.
Yeah.
Her husband is basically ruled out, though, her ex-husband.
He did come immediately when we requested that he do so. His interview went well. His story checked out right immediately after we had interviewed him. We went to where he was living, and confirmed his whereabouts. And we had, over the years, never developed anything to suggest that we missed something along those lines. And unfortunately, now he's no longer with us.
So he has a solid alibi that's been checked out, and he was at least 5 or 6 hours away at the time.
Yes.
And you feel comfortable with the alibi and the people who...
Yes, and combined with his demeanor when he was interviewed, early on in the investigation, his response would be as I would expect it to be.
What you've mentioned that a couple times. So what would it have looked like if it didn't go that way?
Sometimes in this situation, a person that's being considered might become hostile and not want to talk for whatever reasons, or something along those lines. He seemed to be straightforward and had nothing to hide.
Were there other people that you interviewed that were not that way?
There were other people interviewed that were off and on cooperative.
Do you consider them persons of interest?
Possibly.
These locals?
They were at the time.
Okay.
So how many people, 4 or 5, that you think that could be?
I can't put a number on it, but there were people that were considered for one reason or another and not totally eliminated as a person of interest.
So you believe that you spoke to the killer of Sheila?
I wouldn't go that far.
But you believe the person was interviewed?
I wouldn't say that either. It's just that there were people that were questioned that still could be considered. They haven't been eliminated.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Who was the person that first contacted her ex-husband about it?
That I don't recall, whether I did that myself or Lieutenant King, but it was either one or the other that made that contact. It may have been myself, but I don't recall.
So there wasn't anything significant that stood out? Because I can't imagine the phone call to an ex-husband about this is easy to do.
And, that's why I'm not so sure that I made it. See, that's something I think I would remember, because it would be. It's one of those difficult things you do as a police officer. Irregardless of what their marital status was at the time, it's a loss of a family member.
Mm-hmm. And when you first met him, he was completely cooperative?
Yes.
Was he sober?
Yes.
So you believe the killer was known to Sheila, but you're not sure that you interviewed this person?
That would be correct.
So how many people do you know, I guess, that were out there that weren't on your guys' radar? Like, that she might have known? Do you know what I mean? Like, I guess, how many people did she know that no one else knew and told you about?
That's hard to say, but it seems though, with their inner circle and family, that, anyone that was somehow connected to her we became aware of, and we're able to, question them, verify what they had told us, if we could. But yeah, there certainly could be somebody out there that we didn't know about. I mean, that could be the problem. That
Yeah.
It's the unknown, but it seems as though it was someone she knew that would be invited into her home.
What was your first impression when you saw that she was stabbed and it was post-mortem?
Well, at that time, we didn't know that it was, after death. But the whole situation just didn't fit what you would expect in that type of a crime.
So when you came into the scene and you said that it wasn't what you'd expect with that type of a crime, what type of a crime did you see when you first walked in?
When I was first called in, I only had what I was told over the telephone that I needed to be there because there had been a homicide. And until you actually see the scene, you don't know what it's all about.
Yep.
And with this particular scene, the difference with what you might anticipate was there was no sign of a struggle. The apartment was relatively neat, as though it just something totally unusual took place. And then, the things that were found as a result of it, how she was left.
Okay, so it was more like the closer you looked at it from that point forward.
It doesn't fit the normal, revenge or temper or something of that nature. That was another thing that, in my mind, relieved the estranged husband too. Is there was no indication that this was because someone was mad.
Yeah.
Or fighting or anything of that nature.
Is the post-mortem stab wounds or wound, is that something you've seen before or since?
I had not.
Yeah.
And it was considered to be unusual by most people in this field.
Was that something that John Douglas keyed in on?
It was one of his considerations.
Does that mean to him that it was a person, was that like indicative of some kind of misdirection attempt?
That I don't know.
Yeah.
Right, because then we were talking about that before, where it's like, well, you could consider that it was misdirection, right? Or they were just trying to confuse.
Speculate
Yeah.
that something went horribly wrong, but if that were the case, they went to great lengths to make it look totally different.
Yeah.
Does it strike you as like an accidental death, and then they wanted to make it look like a homicide for some reason?
That could be considered.
But why would someone do that? Like this was we batted that around too. Like why would someone, if they were in her presence and it was an accidental death, I guess she didn't have a phone there, but you could go to a payphone. Like you could try to get help. It's weird that you would wait that long to put a knife in someone's stomach to make it look like a homicide.
That's what makes this case
Yeah.
so unusual.
Yeah.
And the time spent with the victim after she was dead seems very unusual to me too.
Because what we had been talking about was it takes time for the blood to stop actually like pumping through your body, and there's no blood from
that's how the conclusion was drawn, that this is post-mortem stabbing.
Yeah. When did you find out about that?
Well, there was no evidence that this took place as part of the original crime.
Yeah.
And then was verified through autopsy.
Was there ever a thought in your head that she wasn't killed there?
It was considered, but again, there wasn't evidence to support that it happened anywhere but there.
Right. And you guys have you guys ever thought that?
No, like I said, because of the lividity and the way that,
Right.
the pooling, she's undressed, and I guess to be carrying a dead body through the streets, even late at night you would think would arouse some degree of suspicion or someone calling in.
But most importantly, the fact that the lividity was consistent with her being at that location from the time of death.
And what does that mean, lividity?
Once you die, the body goes through various stages. The blood flow stops and it settles. So if you were to be found laying here, and the lividity had settled into certain portions. There's evidence to support that.
And how was the scene left after her body was removed? How long did you stay there? Did you see it through until the body was removed?
I'm not sure that I stayed for that part. I may have been assigned to do follow-up interviews with the immediate family.
Okay. And is it just my thinking about this through movie, the movie world? Was there crime tape up? Was there do not any sort of?
I don't believe we were into crime tape at that era.
Okay.
Was the window locked back up, I guess?
Yeah.
Once we were done,
Yeah.
The apartment was secured.
Secured, okay.
Okay. So anybody who would go back in there would have to have a key or break in.
Right.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Yeah, so I guess what kind of stuff do you guys talk about when you
Yeah.
hop on the phone or get together?
I guess just different things where I'll read a report from back then. I know I've asked Tom for clarification. I guess terms are not always the same then as they are now. Like the way we'll write something up, or the way that we go about doing something. There's names in there that are sometimes like nicknames or abbreviations that'll be like, who was this, or what was this person. He's steered me towards who that was, or a name will pop up and I'll say, whatever happened with this person was that, like, oh yeah, we talked to him, we'd follow that up, that they were alibied or whatever the case may be.
The access to find people with us is a lot easier with master name in our system. So you put a name in and a date of birth, you can find out where they lived and that. And then he didn't have a lot of that technology. So it's nice to find somebody who actually knows maybe who this person is. You know.
Yeah. When you were getting reports back then, and people were calling in with statements, and maybe there was other departments in the state that had similar crimes. How do you reach out, like in 1980? How do you find out about other district or other counties? And
Well, there would have been a teletype message, which was our means of communication with other police agencies.
I have no idea what that is.
Okay. It's quite archaic in
Is it like
today's world. It was texting of that area. What it was is you would go on an in-house telecommunication system, which was called teletype. There were various categories of crimes that fit, and you put your crime in there. In this particular case was a homicide, and you put in as much information as you could to, jolt other agencies to, do we have something like this? Do we have a person that could be of interest to Saratoga Springs Police? And from that, yes, we did get some responses. We did explore some other people who had been arrested for like crimes.
You say like crimes?
Homicides with unusual happenings.
Yeah.
Like post-mortem stuff?
Things like that. You probably know, some of these other things like the initial killer
The alphabet
from
code,
the
yeah.
other coast, and things like that, which that was considered in view of our Saratoga Springs and Sheila Shepherd.
Okay, Lance, so that was the interview, or the first part of the interview with investigator Tom Mitchell. Definitely a great guy to talk to, but you kind of hit the nail on the head what you said in the intro, that he kind of treated us like press, like typical press after, once the cameras started rolling. But, no disrespect to him. I understand his process. He's been trained to do such.
Yeah. And he was totally gracious when we weren't recording. He was gracious when we were recording, but he's a super nice guy. He did many years with law enforcement, and he still currently works with them on fire investigations. So he's not getting out of that mentality anytime soon. I was really sort of taken aback by how comfortably we slipped into the role of asking him questions. I think at some point there's a moment where, and I can't pinpoint exactly what this moment was, but when it was realized that he wasn't going to be giving us exactly what we wanted in a forthcoming way, so we had to shift. And I remember kind of sweating for a little while, and then just shifting into this other mode of, I guess now I'm just going to have to pretend like I'm an investigator questioning a suspect or something.
Right. We're trying to get the information from him. Yeah, pry it from him. Because there was a little bit of a game being played. Obviously, that's kind of what happens with media and someone, us being the media in this case.
Yeah, and it's also a testament to his professionalism.
Sure.
And the case itself, the integrity of the case. He still wants to maintain that, and he is very guarded about who he shares the information with, because he probably has so much information that could put somebody to jail for this. He just can't connect the dots yet, and he's not going to give it all up to you and I right away.
Yeah, Tom Mitchell has a lot of clear information. He's obviously evidence-based. He's not going to give you his thoughts on it or his speculation. He's just going to give you the facts. And that's up to us to do, which is why we're here in this outro, quite frankly. One thing I found really interesting, Lance, is that I think it was episode 6 in this series, we spoke about how we believe it's possible Sheila's killer went back to her apartment later that week. And we found out in this interview with Mr. Tom Mitchell that there was, I think, only a few days later, maybe 3 days later. And Tom said it was, quote, unfounded about someone going back to the apartment. He said, we found no evidence of that. But I want to be clear, that doesn't exactly mean that it didn't happen. He just said we found no evidence of that.
Right. It's unfounded. We found no evidence of it. What we do know is that there is a account of what appears to be a flashlight moving through Sheila's apartment after she's murdered in the days after. And we do know that photographs were missing, and we do know that the keys were found across the street. We're just trying to put together maybe a possible scenario, and we're trying to, we're not trying to force it together, but there's an account and there's things missing, and there's, I guess, in our heads, maybe some credible, I guess, evidence that there would be somebody in there, or there was somebody in there. Whether it was a killer or not, who knows, but who else would it be?
Yeah, landlord maybe, I don't know, but it was around midnight, I think, so that's a bit peculiar for sure. Yeah, there's just one of the things that Tom didn't really want to get into. Another thing was the Cool Whip when that came up. So there was a Cool Whip type substance that was found on, I believe, some silverware and on a plate in Sheila's sink. So that might come into play later. We're really not sure. That perhaps connects to a person of interest, but Tom really wasn't giving us that information right now, but it could be relevant later.
Yeah, right. There was a little bit of relevance there, possible relevance there, but he also said that this may be like Ajax or something that would clean silverware, clean dishes, like a residue. Left it open for the interpretation. And again, like you said, this is something that may come into play later.
And I thought it was interesting that Tom said the alibi, quote, relieved the estranged husband. So that would be Sheila's ex-husband, who we spoke about in some of the last episodes, especially with Sheila's aunt, Terry, who sort of believes that he might have been responsible. And so we kind of debate that, but it is interesting to hear Tom really, impressed by the alibi. So it does sound like Tom Mitchell doesn't think Sheila's ex-husband had anything to do with this.
Right. I mean, the alibi is pretty rock solid if the timeline that has been established right at 1980, right in that time frame when she was murdered, if that is rock solid, then yes, Shep, her ex-husband, has a airtight alibi. I would say that there's no real chance that he would be able to make that journey and perform that act and get back to some location that was safe for him. But that's if the timeline is rock solid. I don't know if Tom has actually considered Sheila maybe killed outside of that timeline.
Yeah, I would bet he's probably considered a lot. So I don't know. For whatever reason, he is it sounds pretty convinced about the ex-husband alibi. So yeah, we'll certainly go with it. It does sound like the other investigators, Callahan and Wilson, also believe that. But I think they obviously don't want to be disrespectful to Sheila's family, who maybe believes that Shep was responsible. And finally, Lance, I wanted to bring up the alphabet murders that was discussed briefly in this episode. There were a span of 3 murders from November 16th, 1971 to November 26th, 1973 in New York. The killer is unapprehended as far as we know. There is some speculation that people believe it's a guy named Joseph Nasso. But interesting, right around Rochester, New York is where these murders happened, and the victims were double initialed people. So Sheila Shepherd would fit into that if this guy or this killer killed Sheila, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to look at Sheila Shepherd from Saratoga Springs and not connect it to the alphabet murders. The victims in the alphabet murders were Carmen Colon, Wanda Walkowitz, and Michelle Manza. And they were also killed during, like you said, from November 16th, 1971 to November 26th, 1973. So if you're looking at all of the connections here with the alphabet murder, you do have the double letters in both Sheila's name and the town and the time frame. She was discovered on November 25th, so she was killed around the same time frame as these people too, these other young women.
Yeah, anywhere from about 7 to 9 years later or something like that. But I would say the biggest difference here is the age of these victims. They're all 10 or 11, and Sheila was an adult.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Tim, because I was considering that as well. You have these young girls, they're 10 or 11 years old, and you have 9 years that pass, and I was wondering if we were to consider this person to be the same person who kills Sheila Shepherd, did he grow up as his victims would have? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a fair point. The only other thing I'd add is that Rochester is about 3.5 hours away of a drive, about 221 miles away from Saratoga Springs. So obviously not impossible for the killer to have moved, but it seems like a different situation to me. But there are some similarities with ligatures and things like that,
and apparent sexual motivation. There was no obvious sexual abuse to Sheila Shepherd. However, she was stripped naked and tied to a bed. Whether that was done post-mortem or not, there would be a suggestion of something similar with the tying, with the binding, and also with the apparent sexual motivation. But it's really hard to not look at the alphabet murders when you're talking about Sheila Shepherd from Saratoga Springs, same state, same time of the year, late November.
Thank you very much, everybody. We will be back soon with more.